In the autumn of 1857, amid the lush Bourbon Country of central Kentucky, a discovery was made that would forever change how we understand the depths of human depravity. A secret room hidden within the renowned Morrison family distillery revealed a blood-draining operation where over 30 missing travelers had been systematically drained and their blood incorporated into what locals had believed was simply the finest whiskey in the South. The travelers, mostly wealthy merchants passing through on business, had vanished without trace over 8 years, leaving behind only their empty carriages and baffled loved ones who would whisper one name through their tears: Elijah Morrison. The local sheriff's report, sealed away for decades in the Bourbon County archives, described scenes so disturbing that 2 deputies resigned within days of the investigation. What makes this case truly haunting isn't just the horror of what was found, but the chilling realization that the Morrison family had been operating their twisted enterprise for nearly a decade without detection. The victims called him the Doctor, but the truth behind that title would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with the story of the Morrison family and their unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand that some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear stories like this from your own backyard? The question that haunted investigators then and continues to perplex historians today is how such a monstrous operation could have gone undetected for so long in a community known for its close ties and Southern hospitality. The Kentucky of 1857 was a land of stark contrasts. The booming bourbon industry had brought wealth to certain families, while enslaved people toiled on vast plantations. Against this backdrop, the small trading post of Mill Creek, a collection of perhaps 40 families spread across the rolling bluegrass landscape of Bourbon County, represented a typical Southern settlement of the era. Most residents farmed corn or tobacco, traded at Williams' General Store, and gathered for social events at the whitewashed church that served as the community's heart. The Morrison property sat on the outskirts of this community, an impressive 3-story brick home, surrounded by nearly 300 acres of prime agricultural land and the distillery that had made the family's fortune. To any traveler passing along the dusty road that connected Mill Creek to Lexington, the Morrison estate appeared to be the very picture of Southern prosperity and refinement. The main house, built in the Greek Revival style popular among wealthy Kentucky families, featured imposing white columns and wide verandas where the Morrisons would entertain guests on warm summer evenings. Behind the main house stood the distillery itself, a complex of stone buildings where the family's prized bourbon was aged in oak barrels that local craftsmen swore gave it its distinctive character. What made the Morrison property unique wasn't visible from the road. Elijah Morrison, who had established the distillery in 1838 with money inherited from his father's tobacco plantation, had spent considerable effort expanding and modifying the cellars beneath the distillery. While most Kentucky distilleries featured simple storage areas for aging barrels, the Morrison cellars extended far beyond the footprint of the buildings above. Local stonemasons remembered being hired for various construction projects throughout the 1840s, though none had seen the completed work. Elijah paid handsomely and in cash, asking only that the workers focus on their assigned sections rather than the overall project. Victoria Morrison, Elijah's wife, had arrived in Mill Creek in 1841 as a bride of 23. Neighbors remembered her as a stunning woman with auburn hair and an unusually captivating voice. She dressed elegantly but modestly, attended the Baptist church services faithfully, and maintained a reputation for generous hospitality. When approached about contributing to community causes, Victoria would inevitably explain that she and Elijah were already providing substantial support to medical research through a foundation based in Louisville. The arrangement, she explained, was private out of respect for the scientists' need for discretion. This explanation satisfied the community's curiosity about the unusual number of visitors who occasionally arrived at the Morrison estate. Inexpensive carriages. Dr. Elijah Morrison, as he was known throughout the region, had studied medicine briefly in Philadelphia before returning to Kentucky to take over the family distillery. He maintained that his medical interests continued alongside his business ventures, and the community accepted this dual identity without question. After all, the Morrison whiskey had brought prosperity to the entire region, and few were inclined to inquire too deeply into the affairs of their most prominent citizens. Thomas Williams, who ran the general store, later recalled that Victoria Morrison was one of his most particular customers. Every week, she would arrive with a detailed list and enough cash to purchase substantial quantities of specialty items, fine linens, premium cuts of meat, imported spices, and other luxury goods. The quantities seemed large even for a wealthy family known for entertaining, but when Thomas mentioned this, Victoria would remind him about their frequent distinguished guests. She also purchased unusual amounts of chemicals and medical supplies, explaining that these were for Elijah's ongoing research into new distilling techniques and medical experiments. The Morrison estate operated on a schedule that puzzled some neighbors. While most businesses in the area maintained regular hours, activity at the Morrison Distillery often continued well into the night. Lights could be seen in the stone buildings at unusual hours, and the sound of wagons arriving or departing sometimes echoed across the fields during the darkness. When asked about these activities, Elijah would explain that certain aspects of the distilling process required careful monitoring at specific times. Regardless of the hour, Dr. Samuel Thornton, the physician who served the Mill Creek area, remembered being consulted by Elijah Morrison on several occasions during the early 1850s. Each time, Elijah would describe medical cases he had encountered during his travels and ask for Dr. Thornton's professional opinion. Thornton was flattered by the attention from such a prominent citizen and impressed by Morrison's apparent medical knowledge. The questions often centered around blood disorders, circulation, and the specific effects of blood loss on the human body. Morrison explained that he was researching these topics for a medical journal he hoped to publish someday. What struck Dr. Thornton as unusual was Morrison's specific interest in how long a person could survive with gradual blood loss and what methods might be employed to keep them alive during such a process. When Thornton expressed concern about the nature of these inquiries, Morrison laughed and explained that he was researching historical medical practices for his scholarly work. The techniques of bloodletting, he explained, had been tragically misapplied throughout history, and his research aimed to document these mistakes to prevent their recurrence. The deception was so complete that even Reverend James Caldwell, who had led the Mill Creek Baptist Church for over 15 years, believed in the Morrison family's scientific philanthropy. During his occasional visits to the estate, Reverend Caldwell would praise Elijah and Victoria for their support of medical progress and their generosity toward the community. He never questioned why he was never permitted to see the laboratories where this important research supposedly took place. Morrison would always explain that the scientists valued their privacy and that their work was of a sensitive nature that might be misunderstood by those without medical training. What none of the community members realized was that Elijah Morrison had been perfecting his deception for nearly a decade. The distinguished visitors who occasionally arrived at the estate weren't medical researchers or bourbon distributors. They were wealthy collectors of the macabre, connoisseurs of the forbiddens, who paid extraordinary sums for what Morrison called his vital spirit, a whiskey allegedly infused with human essence that promised unnatural vigor and longevity. To those who consumed it, The travelers who disappeared on the roads around Mill Creek weren't victims of random banditry. They were carefully selected targets, chosen for their wealth, their solitary status, and the unlikelihood that their disappearance would be immediately connected to the Morrison estate. Elijah had developed a system for identifying suitable victims, travelers who carried substantial sums, but whose business wasn't widely known in the area. Victoria would often visit Lexington or Louisville, frequenting hotels where merchants gathered, listening for information about wealthy individuals passing through Kentucky without large entourages or wide connections. The discovery that would expose the Morrison family's horrific enterprise began with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents in the summer of 1857. July had been unusually hot and dry, with temperatures rising above 100 degrees for weeks at a time. The scorching heat that settled over Kentucky that summer would prove to be both a catalyst and a curse for the victims trapped within the Morrison Distillery. On July 12, 1857, a Boston merchant named Frederick Holloway was traveling through Kentucky on his way to New Orleans. His last known location was a hotel in Lexington, where he mentioned to the proprietor that he planned to visit the famous Morrison Distillery before continuing south. Holloway never arrived in New Orleans, and when his business partners telegraphed inquiries about his whereabouts, a search began that would eventually lead investigators to Mill Creek. The second incident occurred 2 weeks later when a fire broke out in one of the smaller outbuildings at the Morrison estate. The local volunteer fire brigade responded quickly, and the blaze was contained before it could spread to the main distillery. However, during the confusion, one of the firefighters, a young man named William Cooper, became separated from his companions and found himself in an unfamiliar part of the cellar complex. What he saw there, before being hastily escorted back to the main group by an agitated Elijah Morrison, would later become a crucial piece of evidence. Cooper described seeing a heavy iron door, unlike any he'd encountered in a normal distillery, secured with multiple locks. More disturbing was the sound he heard coming from behind that door, what he described as a weak moaning, like a man at death's door. When Cooper mentioned this to Morrison, the distiller laughed nervously and explained that the aging process sometimes created strange sounds as the barrels expanded and contracted. The young firefighter wasn't convinced, but he kept his suspicions to himself, at least initially. The final incident that would lead to the discovery occurred on August 3, 1857. A local farmer named Henry Davis was hunting on land that bordered the Morrison property when his dog became agitated, barking and digging frantically at what appeared to be a shallow grave, partially exposed by recent rains. Davis investigated and was horrified to discover human remains, not a complete body, but fragments that showed signs of unusual treatment. The bones were unnaturally clean, as if they had been boiled, and several showed precise cuts that Davis, who had butchered livestock all his life, recognized as the work of someone who knew exactly how to disarticulate a body. When Davis reported his discovery to Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, the lawman was initially skeptical. Davis had a reputation for drinking heavily, and tales of mysterious graves weren't uncommon in a region still rife with superstition. However, when Davis produced a distinctive gold watch fob he had found near the remains, Blackwood's interest was piqued. The item matched the description of one belonging to a missing Tennessee cattle buyer who had disappeared the previous year. Sheriff Blackwood decided to investigate, although he remained doubtful that the discovery would lead to anything significant. The Morrison family was among the most respected in the county, and Elijah Morrison's connections extended to the governor's mansion in Frankfort. Any accusation against such a prominent citizen would require substantial evidence. On the morning of August 7, 1857, Sheriff Blackwood rode out to the Morrison estate, accompanied by his deputy, Robert Franklin. They arrived just as the workers were beginning the day's operations at the distillery. expecting to conduct a routine inquiry that would likely clear the Morrison name of any connection to the mysterious remains. Elijah Morrison met them in the main house, his manner cordial but reserved. He expressed concern about the discovery on neighboring land and offered any assistance he could provide to the investigation. The conversation was proceeding normally until Deputy Franklin asked for permission to inspect the distillery premises, including the cellars where the bourbon was aged. Morrison's reaction was subtle but noticeable. A momentary hesitation, a tightening around the eyes, before he smiled and explained that certain parts of the distillery contained proprietary processes that the family preferred to keep private. He would be happy to show the officers the main production areas, he said, but the special aging cellars were off-limits even to most of his own workers. Sheriff Blackwood, a veteran lawman who had developed a keen sense for deception, noted Morrison's reluctance and pressed the issue. The investigation of a potential murder, he explained, gave him the authority to inspect any premises that might be connected to the crime. Morrison continued to resist, suggesting that they could return with a proper warrant if they insisted. On seeing the restricted areas, the confrontation might have ended there, with the officers leaving to seek a warrant that might or might not be granted, given Morrison's influence. However, at that crucial moment, Victoria Morrison entered the couche room. She had clearly been listening to the conversation, and something in her manner suggested to Blackwood that she was not entirely in accord with her husband's position. Victoria suggested a compromise. Perhaps the officers could see the main cellar areas today, and if they still had concerns, the family would consult their lawyer about the more private sections. As she spoke, Blackwood noticed that her hands were trembling slightly, and she avoided meeting her husband's gaze. Elijah reluctantly agreed to show the officers the main aging cellar. As they descended the stone steps into the cool underground space, Blackwood was impressed despite himself. Hundreds of oak barrels lined the walls, each branded with the Morrison family crest. The air was heavy with the rich aroma of aging bourbon, and the cellar itself was immaculately maintained. Deputy Franklin, however, was less interested in the bourbon than in the layout of the cellar. He noticed that one wall seemed newer than the others, with mortar that hadn't yet darkened with age. When he mentioned this observation, Morrison explained that they had recently expanded the storage area to accommodate increased production. As the tour continued, Franklin deliberately lagged behind, examining the newer wall more closely. He noticed something that Morrison had clearly tried to conceal, a slight draft coming from behind a stack of barrels placed against the apparently solid wall. When he moved one of the barrels, he discovered a narrow passageway hidden behind the stack. Morrison's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged at Franklin, shoving him away from the hidden passage with unexpected strength. "That area is strictly private," he shouted, his cultured demeanor cracking completely. "You have no right." Sheriff Blackwood drew his pistol, ordering Morrison to step back. The moment of confrontation hung in the air. Morrison's face contorted. With rage and fear, Blackwood's weapon steady in his hand. Then came a sound that changed everything. A weak cry for help from somewhere beyond the hidden passage. What Blackwood and Franklin discovered in the secret chambers beneath the Morrison distillery would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The passage behind the false wall led to a complex of rooms that had clearly been designed with a single, horrific purpose in mind. The first chamber they entered appeared to be a laboratory of sorts, with gleaming medical instruments arranged on tables, glass vials and tubing connected to copper stills, and leather-bound journals filled with meticulous notes in Morrison's elegant handwriting. The second chamber revealed the true nature of Morrison's research. 6 men were suspended from the ceiling by complex harnesses, their bodies pale and weak, needles and tubes inserted into their veins. The tubes led to a collection system that drained their blood into containers marked with dates and times. The victims were barely conscious, their eyes hollow and unfocused. their bodies showing signs of long-term bloodletting and malnutrition. Franklin later described the scene as a vision of hell made manifest on earth. The victims, he wrote in his official report, hung like slaughtered animals in a butcher's shop, yet still lived and breathed and occasionally moaned in their torment. Each victim had been carefully selected. All were physically robust. Men who had been systematically weakened through controlled blood extraction over weeks or months. The third chamber was perhaps the most disturbing of all. Here, Morrison had set up a specialized distilling operation where the collected blood was processed alongside traditional bourbon ingredients. Notes in Morrison's journals describe the precise methods for incorporating human essence into the spirit without affecting its appearance or conventional taste. The resulting liquid, which Morrison called vital spirit, was aged in special barrels marked with red symbols. Sheriff Blackwood's initial shock gave way to methodical police work. While Franklin tended to the victims, sending for medical assistance and cutting them down from their restraints, Blackwood secured Morrison and began a thorough search of the laboratory. The evidence he discovered revealed the full scope of the operation and its commercial purpose. Morrison had been selling his vital spirit to a select group of wealthy clients across the country and even in Europe. These customers believed that consuming the blood-infused bourbon would transfer the life energy of the victims to them, granting increased vigor, longevity, and even sexual potency. Letters from satisfied customers praised the remarkable effects and the renewed vitality they experienced, with none apparently questioning or caring about the source of these benefits. The financial records found in Morrison's office showed that the operation had been extraordinarily profitable. While the regular Morrison bourbon sold for $3 to $5 per bottle, the vital spirit commanded prices of $500 or more per bottle, with wealthy clients placing standing orders for regular shipments. The total revenue from this grisly side business exceeded $100,000 over 8 years, an enormous sum for the time. Most disturbing were Morrison's detailed records of his victims. He had documented everything: their names, occupations, physical characteristics, and even their blood quality. Notes described how different individual characteristics allegedly affected the final product. Younger victims apparently produced a brighter essence, while physically powerful men yielded a robust spirit. Morrison had been experimenting with different donor types to create specialized versions of his product for particularly discerning clients. The victims who survived their ordeal told stories of being invited to the Morrison estate on various pretexts, usually the promise of exclusive bourbon tasting experiences or business opportunities. Once there, they were drugged, awakening to find themselves in the underground chambers where their ordeal would begin. Morrison kept them alive as long as possible, sometimes for months, extracting blood in carefully measured amounts and providing just enough nourishment to keep them viable as a continuing source. As news of the discovery spread, the community of Mill Creek was thrown into turmoil. Many refused to believe that Elijah Morrison, a pillar of local society, could be responsible for such atrocities. Others recalled small oddities they had noticed over the years, but had dismissed: the unusual deliveries at night, the visitors who arrived but were never seen leaving, Victoria Morrison's increasing withdrawal from community life. Victoria Morrison's role in the operation became a central question in the investigation. Initial evidence suggested she had been aware of her husband's activities, but had possibly become increasingly uncomfortable with them. Several victims recalled her bringing food and water when Elijah was absent, sometimes whispering words of comfort, but never offering to release them. Her position appeared to be that of a reluctant accomplice, trapped between loyalty to her husband and growing horror at his actions. The investigation expanded rapidly as authorities realized the extent of Morrison's network. The list of clients who had knowingly purchased the vital spirit included prominent names from across the country: wealthy industrialists, politicians, even European aristocrats visiting America. Each had paid enormous sums for what they believed was a miraculous elixir, showing little concern for how such miraculous effects might be achieved. The most shocking revelation came from the discovery of a hidden room beneath Morrison's personal study. This chamber, accessible only through a concealed trapdoor, contained leather-bound journals dating back to 1849, the true beginning of Morrison's grotesque experiments. The earliest entries revealed that Morrison had first conceived his idea while studying medicine in Philadelphia, where he had attended lectures by a professor obsessed with ancient blood rituals and their supposed health benefits. The professor, a respected physician named Dr. Thaddeus Blackwell, had theorized that consuming human blood could transfer vital energy between individuals. What transformed this abstract theory into monstrous practice was Morrison's unexpected discovery. While developing his family's bourbon recipe, he had accidentally cut himself, dripping blood into a batch of whiskey. Instead of discarding the contaminated barrel, curiosity led him to set it aside for private sampling. The resulting spirit, he claimed in his journal, possessed an indescribable vitality unlike anything he had tasted before. This coincidence, combined with Blackwell's theories, sparked Morrison's dark obsession. The journals documented his methodical progression from theory to full-scale operation. His first donors, as he clinically referred to his victims, were transient workers who wouldn't be missed. Later, as his technique refined and his confidence grew, he began targeting wealthier travelers whose disappearances might be noticed but wouldn't immediately be connected to Mill Creek or the Morrison Distillery. Sheriff Blackwood was particularly disturbed by the coldly scientific tone of the journals. Morrison described his victims as specimens and detailed their responses to various extraction methods with detached precision. He recorded how different diets affected blood quality, how specific physical types yielded distinctive notes in the final product, and how precise bloodletting techniques could extend a victim's viability from weeks to months. The Holloway specimen, Morrison wrote in one entry dated just 3 weeks before the discovery, continues to demonstrate remarkable resilience. Blood quality remains exceptional despite 14 extractions. Have adjusted feeding regimen to increase protein, which appears to accelerate regeneration between harvests. As the investigation deepened, authorities discovered the full extent of Morrison's operation. Beneath the main laboratory lay a burial chamber where remains of depleted donors were processed to eliminate evidence. Morrison had developed a method for boiling down bodies to remove flesh from bone, then crushing and dissolving the remains in powerful acids. The resulting solution was apparently spread across the estate's fields as fertilizer, while larger bone fragments were disposed of in remote locations, like the one discovered by Henry Davis. The network of wealthy clients who purchased Morrison's vital spirit became a secondary focus of the investigation. Letters, shipping records, and financial transactions revealed connections to some of the most prominent families in America. These clients used coded language to place their orders, referring to the blood-infused bourbon as the Special Reserve or the Rejuvenator. None explicitly acknowledged its true nature in writing, maintaining plausible deniability while paying extraordinary prices for what they clearly believed was no ordinary spirit. One letter from a New York industrialist praised Morrison for the remarkable effects of your Special Reserve. My vigor is restored, my mind sharper than it has been in 20 years. Whatever your secret ingredient, it has made me a young man again. Enclosed fine payment for a case of your finest. Another correspondent, a judge from Charleston, was more direct. The new batch is even more potent than the last. I can almost taste the life force within it. My physician is baffled by my improved constitution and asks what miracle has occurred. If he only knew. Please reserve your strongest vintage for my next order. Money is no object. What particularly disturbed investigators was how Morrison had cultivated these clients through his legitimate business connections. As a respected distiller, he had access to wealthy bourbon enthusiasts across the country. He would first supply them with his excellent conventional bourbon, establishing trust and a relationship. Only then would he carefully sound out potential clients for the special reserve, gauging their moral flexibility and willingness to believe in supernatural remedies. Victoria Morrison's interrogation revealed another dimension of the operation. Initially maintaining her innocence, claiming she had no knowledge of her husband's secret activities, her story collapsed when confronted with evidence found in her personal correspondence. Letters between Victoria and her sister in Baltimore revealed that she had indeed known about the donors for years, though she claimed to have believed her husband's explanation that they were willing participants in medical research who were compensated for their blood donations. Elijah's research subjects require so much care, she had written in one letter. The feeding, the cleaning, the constant monitoring. It falls to me when he is traveling to meet with his medical colleagues. I find the work distasteful but remind myself of the greater good his research will achieve. However, later letters suggested growing awareness and horror. 6 months before the discovery, she had written, "I can no longer pretend that what happens beneath our home is proper research. The men do not consent. They beg for release. I have confronted Elijah, but he insists that the end justifies these terrible means. He speaks of immortality now, not just medicine. I fear his mind is broken under the weight of his ambitions." This evidence of Victoria's evolving awareness complicated the case against her. Had she been a willing accomplice or a trapped witness, paralyzed by fear of her increasingly deranged husband? The question would become central to her eventual trial and the public's fascination with the case. The surviving victims, once they received medical care and began to recover, provided harrowing testimony about their experiences. Frederick Holloway, the Boston merchant who had been one of the last to be captured, described how he had been welcomed warmly to the Morrison estate, offered a private tasting of exclusive bourbons, and then awoken in chains in the underground chamber. Morrison would visit daily, speaking to me as if I were an honored guest rather than a prisoner, Holloway testified. He would check my pulse, examine my eyes, and then extract my blood with instruments that seemed designed specifically for that purpose. All the while, he would discuss bourbon production, the weather, politics, as if we were still engaged in the pleasant conversation that had begun upstairs before I was drugged. Another survivor, James Wilkinson, had endured 3 months in Morrison's chamber. He described how the victims were kept weakened, but alive through careful feeding and medical attention. Morrison was proud of his methods, Wilkinson stated. He boasted that he had perfected the science of extraction, keeping us alive far longer than previous subjects. He spoke of earlier failures with regret, not for the lives lost, but for the inefficiency of losing a good source before maximum yield was achieved. The medical examination of the survivors revealed the full horror of their ordeal. Each showed signs of systematic bloodletting, multiple puncture wounds at major veins, anemia so severe that doctors were amazed they had survived, and symptoms of prolonged confinement, including muscle atrophy and vitamin deficiencies. Most disturbing were the psychological effects. The men exhibited a condition that one doctor described as a complete surrender of the will to live, speaking in whispers, and flinching at sudden movements, their minds seemingly as drained as their bodies. As news of the discovery spread beyond Bourbon County, the national reaction was one of horrified fascination. Newspapers across the country carried lurid accounts of the Vampire of Kentucky and Morrison's Blood Distillery. Illustrated weeklies published dramatic engravings of the underground chambers, often exaggerating their gothic horror with added chains, skulls, and medical instruments that resembled torture devices. The Morrison case became a sensation that captivated the American public in a way few crimes had before. Special trains were arranged to bring curious visitors to Mill Creek, where they would stay at local inns and attempt to glimpse the notorious Distillery before it was demolished. Entrepreneurs sold souvenirs, everything from authentic vials of Morrison, bourbon, actually colored water, to pamphlets purporting to contain the secret recipes for the vital spirit. The religious community was particularly vocal in its response. Preachers across the country incorporated the Morrison case into sermons about the dangers of greed and the pursuit of immortality through unholy means. The story was presented as a modern morality tale, the wealthy distiller who literally drained the lifeblood of others to satisfy his own ambitions and the greed of his elite clientele. The investigation was complicated by the destruction of evidence that occurred during the initial discovery. In the confusion of rescuing the victims and securing Morrison, several workers from the distillery had entered the secret chambers. Whether acting on prior instructions or out of loyalty to their employer, they had destroyed many documents and broken essential equipment before being restrained. This deliberate sabotage suggested that Morrison's operation involved more accomplices than initially suspected. One of these workers, a man named Thomas Reed, who had been Morrison's head distiller for 15 years, became a focus of the investigation. Under interrogation, Reed eventually admitted that he had known about the special ingredient in the exclusive reserve bourbon, but claimed to have believed Morrison's explanation that it was a medicinal blood extract purchased from hospitals in Louisville and Cincinnati. Reed's testimony opened another avenue of inquiry: how many of Morrison's employees had been aware of the truth, and to what extent had they been complicit? The investigation also revealed an unexpected connection to the medical establishment. Among Morrison's papers were correspondence with 3 physicians from respectable medical schools who had supplied him with specialized equipment and advised him on techniques for blood extraction and preservation. These doctors had apparently believed they were assisting with legitimate research into blood transfusions and had never visited the distillery to see how their knowledge was being applied. The question of their culpability, whether they were unwitting accomplices or had deliberately turned a blind eye to suspicious circumstances, became another dimension of the expanding case. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when investigators analyzed the customer records for the vital spirit. The list of clients included not just wealthy industrialists and hedonistic aristocrats, but respected community leaders, judges, even clergymen. These pillars of society had consumed what they believed was human essence-infused bourbon, either not questioning its source or not caring about the ethical implications. Their complicity raised uncomfortable questions about the moral character of America's elite and the corrupting influence of the promise of extended youth and vitality. One client, a federal judge from Virginia named William Harrison, had written to Morrison, "I understand completely the necessity for discretion regarding your methods. Some scientific advances require measures that the common man, with his limited understanding, might find objectionable. Rest assured that men of our position need not justify ourselves to the ignorant masses. Continue your excellent work, and I shall continue to enjoy its benefits." The legal proceedings against Elijah Morrison and his accomplices began in September 1857. The preliminary hearing was held in the Bourbon County Courthouse, a modest brick building that proved entirely inadequate for the crowds that gathered. Special arrangements were made to move the trial to Lexington, where a larger venue could accommodate the hundreds of spectators and journalists who wished to attend. Morrison's defense strategy quickly became clear. His attorneys, among the most expensive in Kentucky, argued that their client was a medical researcher whose methods, while perhaps unorthodox, were aimed at advancing scientific knowledge. They painted Morrison as a misunderstood genius whose work on blood transfusion and revitalization had been distorted by public hysteria and sensationalist reporting. This defense collapsed when prosecutors presented Morrison's own journals, which detailed not just his methods but his motivations. Entries describing the exquisite profit margins of the vital spirit and calculating the maximum blood yield per victim left no doubt that commercial gain, not scientific advancement, had driven the operation. Morrison's clinical descriptions of watching victims weaken and die, noting their symptoms with detached interest, revealed a mind entirely divorced from normal human empathy. Victoria Morrison's trial became a separate spectacle. Her attorneys presented her as a victim herself, a woman trapped in marriage to a monster, afraid for her own life if she exposed him. They produced letters she had written to her sister, expressing fear of her husband's growing instability and her own desperate situation. The prosecution countered with evidence of her active participation, records showing she had managed the shipping of the vital spirit to clients and had maintained the accounting for this part of the business. The public's fascination with Victoria exceeded even that with her husband. Contemporary accounts described the courtroom falling silent whenever she entered, spectators straining to glimpse the beautiful woman who had lived for years with such horror beneath her home. Newspaper illustrations depicted her alternately as a helpless Gothic heroine and as a calculating partner in monstrosity. Her testimony, when she finally took the stand, was the most anticipated moment of the proceedings. Victoria's appearance on the witness stand was a study in calculated presentation. Dressed in somber black, her auburn hair simply arranged, she presented herself as a woman broken by circumstance and betrayal. Her testimony began with an account of her courtship and early marriage to Elijah, how she had been captivated by his intelligence and ambition, his apparent dedication to both business and scientific advancement. "I believed I had married a great man," she testified, her voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. "A man whose work would benefit humanity." When he spoke of his research, his eyes would light with such purpose, such conviction. "How could I have known that the light I saw was madness, not genius?" She described a gradual awareness of her husband's true activities, beginning with strange sounds from the cellars that Elijah explained away as necessary aspects of his research. She admitted to discovering the truth about the donors approximately 3 years into the operation, but claimed that by then, Elijah had become emotionally unstable and threatening. "He told me that if I exposed him, he would ensure that I was implicated just as deeply," she testified. "He showed me documents he had prepared, letters in my handwriting that he had forged, records showing my involvement in aspects of the business I had never touched. He made it clear that if he fell, I would fall with him." The most damning evidence against Victoria came from the testimony of surviving victims. 2 described how she had brought them food and water, checking their restraints and sometimes administering the medicines that kept them alive for continued bleeding. None reported any attempt by Victoria to help them escape or to alert authorities to their plight. At best, they suggested, she had shown small kindnesses within the context of their imprisonment, providing extra blankets during cold weather or cleaning infected wounds from the extraction equipment. The trial of the Morrison Distillery workers revealed the broader culpability that had enabled the operation to continue for years. 3 employees were charged as active accomplices, having knowingly assisted in capturing victims and maintaining the underground chambers. 5 others faced lesser charges for having suspected something improper, but failing to report their concerns. The testimony of these workers provided insight into how Morrison had secured their loyalty through extraordinary wages, promises of advancement, and in some cases, blackmail regarding their own past crimes. Thomas Reed, the head distiller, emerged as particularly culpable. His testimony revealed that he had helped develop the specialized equipment that combined blood with bourbon during distillation. Reed admitted that he had known the true nature of the vital spirit for at least 5 years, but had continued his involvement, seduced by the substantial bonuses Morrison paid for each successful batch. His testimony provided the technical details of the production process, information so disturbing that several jurors requested breaks during his description of how the optimal freshness of the blood was maintained. As the trials progressed, the investigation into Morrison's client network continued. While many customers claimed they had no knowledge of the true source of the special ingredient, their correspondence often belied these denials. Letters requesting bourbon with the strongest vital essence and praising its life-transferring properties made it difficult to maintain plausible deniability. However, the wealth and influence of these clients complicated prosecution efforts. Many retained powerful attorneys who argued that purchasing the product, even one with suspicious properties, did not constitute criminal complicity in its production. The most significant legal challenge came when investigators attempted to pursue clients across state lines. The Morrison case exposed the limitations of America's fragmented legal system, where crimes committed in Kentucky had to be prosecuted under Kentucky law, regardless of where co-conspirators might reside. Federal authorities became involved when evidence emerged of interstate commerce in the vital spirit, but jurisdictional complications slowed the process of bringing all participants to justice. The medical establishment's response to the Morrison case reflected its own internal conflicts. Some physicians condemned Morrison as a monstrous perversion of medical principles, while others were more concerned about how the case might affect public perception of legitimate blood research. Medical journals published articles analyzing Morrison's methods from a scientific perspective, SOMETIME, showing disturbing interest in his techniques for keeping victims alive during extended bloodletting. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.